Hello, everyone. It's a joy to be presenting here for you today. Just a note, we've added a content warning to this talk as some of the terms mentioned can be outdated and harmful. So to take us right into it, meanwhile, in a meeting that should have been an email.
It looks like you're bike shedding on the bus factor we have here, but I just want to double click on that.
I mean, I don't want to start yak shaving on this, but I really think we should be dog fooding more.
I appreciate the synergy here. Do you think rubber ducking this might work?
I mean, it might help us grok the idiomatic duck typing we have.
Roger. Let's burn that bridge when we get to it.
And scene.
Folks, have you ever been in a meeting like this? Like where, jargon is being thrown all over the place and you don't quite understand everything being said and you feel a little lost, but you're also a little bit nervous. You don't want to interrupt the flow and, you're a little afraid to ask. A lot of us has been there, if not all of us have been there. And what we want to do today is address that, talk a little bit about the good and the downsides of using jargon at work, the cultural inclusivity that comes with that. But before we do any of that, Sue's already did a little bit, but
I'd love to introduce you to my co-speaker and co-worker, Ramón. He's based in Austria, originally from Chile. He's a developer advocate at Suborbital, DevRel consultant, educator, so many other things, and just general, all-around amazing human.
And it is my esteemed joy to present an even better human. This is Taryn. They're a developer advocate and engineer at Suborbital, works with me. Lucky me. Lucky all of us at the team. They're a community advocate, a workshop instructor, tech career mentor, and overall just a joy to be around and a good friend.
Thanks, Ramón. Now, definition. Dog fooding. Noun. The practice of using one's own products or services. Used in a sentence. The Rust programming language is compiled using Rust. That's dog fooding, right?
Before we get into those good and downsides, if you think about it, when we're using jargon and language overall, that jargon kind of goes all the way down. What we've done today is we've introduced we want to introduce you to some different types of jargon, which we've categorized like this.
So first up, we have tech jargon. So this type of jargon can include things like solid, dry, terms that were created as part of software processes or development. They come from the tech community and can be words that were created as part of communicating software development ideas.
Thanks, Taryn. There's also business jargon. And this one was an interesting one for me when I started out working, particularly as a contractor or at permanent roles, because I spent a lot of time freelancing here in Vienna. But then when I worked to doing more, international contracting and permanent roles, I found myself working with North American companies in particular that used a lot of words, jargon that didn't quite sound like things I would have expected, like dog fooding and sunsetting something, bike shedding. Well, we'll get into that a little bit more. But essentially, this is jargon that describes workplace methodologies or processes.
Right. Next up, we have uncommon daily but common in tech. This category relates to English words that are used commonly in daily language, uncommonly in daily language, gosh. When learning English first or as a supplementary language, these words tend not to show up in regular conversation, but appear quite frequently in tech.
Next, let's talk about acronyms. Who doesn't love acronyms, especially when you don't know what they mean and you're just sort of nodding along, right? Here's a fun fact. Did you know that the first use of OMG, or oh my gosh, seems to be traced back to World War I, so 1917, in a telegram sent to Winston Churchill. So these have been around for a while. And we might think of them as, necessary for the early days of the internet, but we've been, as said, using them for a while, in particular for synchronous time-sensitive communication to share ideas, especially when character limits were present. Now, while these are useful, they can also be misleading, confusing, or, depending on context, could mean different things. More on that later.
Next category we have are emojis. Now, you might not think of emojis as jargon, but emojis can convey a lot of meaning. And that meaning can be wildly different depending on the context. We'll be covering some of the positives and negatives of using jargon at work, offer some tips, goals, and some insights.
Definition: rubber ducking. Phrase: a method of debugging code by articulating a problem in spoken or written natural language. Used in a sentence: can I help you fix the bug you encountered by rubber ducking with you?
Is old jargon bad? Jargon definitely has its uses. As an example, being included is not the same as feeling like you belong. Using common language with your team or workplace can make you feel like you're part of something. Making Slack or Discord emojis as a team or company can create a common language. You can also achieve this using acronyms, internal terms, or just general jargon. So we have on this slide here having a common exclusive language, but we just talked all about being inclusive at work, so that doesn't make sense. But having a common understanding with your team can create a sense of camaraderie, and it's not just for you. As written by Kathy Sierra in her book, Badass, Making Users Awesome, there's this wonderful quote. Learning the technical jargon of a domain enables rich, deeply rewarding conversations, and yes, feels like a superpower. This extends to technical jargon too, as well as products and not just people. And who doesn't want to feel empowered in their workplace?
Thanks, Taryn. And here's the thing. It can be helpful to have jargon, but if wielded improperly, jargon can cause confusion over collecting and understanding. And this ambiguity can lead to harm, which we would like to cover next. When it comes to ambiguity, this can range from simple misunderstandings to harmful or even ableist messages being sent. Let's start with the simple smile emoji. Now, you might not have look at it and think, well, how is that ambiguous? Well, hear me out. In some contexts, and depending on the person, the simple smile, sort of a don't worry about it, simple smile, can either be a friendly gesture or can be ambiguous and be interpreted as passive-aggressive. Same goes for the fire emoji. The fire emoji can be a symbol of something being amazing or something being on fire and we need to fix it.
You know, Ramón, in pull requests, I've seen this emoji used a lot. And sometimes, absolutely, it is used to represent something that is really good. This is on fire. This is great. Or we need to get rid of this code. It can be very confusing.
Totally. Thanks, Taryn. But when it comes to greater harm caused, when emojis or when symbols or jargon like the OK hand emoji, which recently became adopted by hate groups to symbolize white supremacy as a dog whistle or a sort of hidden symbol in public. This can create conflict when interpretations of the past, for example, in scuba diving, the OK hand can mean I'm doing fine. You're usually scuba diving in partners when you're a beginner like me. And this can mean we're doing okay. Of course, in other cultures, for example, a lot of Buddhist statues in, for example, Thailand will use these as well. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to be texting while scuba diving. Well, I don't think you're going to be texting while scuba diving yet. Who knows? But you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about ambiguity and the harm it can cause, but what about just the awkward, sometimes humorous things that can happen? So when I first started as a little developer, I used to see LGTM a lot on pull requests, and I always thought this meant let's get this moving. It was always on a pull request that was just about to be merged. It was almost done, ready to go. And I've also heard of someone who thought this meant let's get this money for pretty much the same reason. They make a product, their product makes them money, so that's what this meant to them. The most common usage of this term, however, is looks good to me. While this isn't a harmful mistake, it certainly means we're not speaking the same language.
Totally. But it doesn't just come from the acronyms. It can also come from the interpretation of what a phrase or turn of phrase means or a piece of jargon. For example, ASAP, as soon as possible. To lay the groundwork, Any fellow native Spanish speakers in the house will know that the term al tiro, or right away, can mean a wide variety of things. That interpretation of how soon is can be widely different. So, depending on the workplace, depending on the culture, what happens if, say, a supervisor will tell you, I need this done ASAP? Are they saying, I need you to stay extra time and make sure the day does not end until you get this done? Or hopefully it means this just goes at the top of the priority list. This lack of clarity can create disjointed expectations.
Absolutely. In the tech world, where a lot of very large companies came out of North America, it can be easy to forget that we're in a global, increasingly remote group of people who operate outside of that area. As someone who didn't grow up in North America, but did grow up in an English-speaking country with English as my first language, I still struggle with North American English, especially with words like bi-weekly. Bi-weekly as a term can mean one of two different things. It can mean twice a week or fortnightly, which is once every 2 weeks.
Same here, honestly. As said, I originally from Chile, grew up in Austria, didn't have that much experience working with North American companies. But once I did, and I learned all of these terms, I'm still thrown off by the term John Hancock, which up until I learned what this term meant, I thought was just a character from, American history and the video. I knew them from the video game Day of the Tentacle. But it turns out it means signature. We've got this jargon that came out of American business developments, particularly 19th and 20th century, whose origins by now are kind of muddy, but are nevertheless cemented in business use. For example, dog fooding. It's not actually confirmed where it comes from. There are different stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about adding context to context. So businesses have their own acronyms, and companies internally create these over time. They become part of the work culture. If you have a lot of these, it might be worthwhile considering whether you need a glossary or documentation for these terms. It can also be useful to have a style guide, which is used for both consistency internally and externally. Acronyms and internal terms can mean different things from company to company and also industry to industry. Context is very important, especially for acronyms. For example, when I worked on the railway as a signal engineer, we had our own alphabet, the signaling alphabet. So the letter H stands for yellow, the letter D is green or clear. And these are used in electrical diagrams used by signal engineers on the railway, but they're different from electrical diagrams used by electricians, which I also was at one point. Both use symbols to represent concepts that can be different depending on the context. But if someone new was to join my team or industry, would they be able to look this up on their search engine of choice, find the information they're looking for, and understand what terms they're trying to convey? A good general thought is, can I Google this?
I'm always amazed by these things, and of course, the variety of experiences you have, Taryn. But something you said there, somebody new joining a team, I think this is critical to what we're trying to say as well. This experience of feeling included and being given the space to learn and also try and understand the language of a work culture as you come in. Onboarding is a critical time to take a step back and examine what that language is like. And by doing so, expand and improve that company or work culture. Because here's the thing, no two onboarding sessions are alike. I mean, not only is the onboardee always different, most of the, I would say, yeah, should be, but the onboarder, the person doing the onboarding, can be different as well. And having these perspectives can mold what that looks like. Making sure that there is space to talk about what language looks like during onboarding, in our opinion, is critical. If language is being used that is lacking context or ambiguous or worse, harmful, it is critical that we give these people space to be able to talk about this.
Not only does language evolve, but our understanding and acceptance of that language moves forward too. Just because it was accepted in the past doesn't mean it's acceptable now.
Absolutely. And what do we do when once we've realized that a term needs updating? We've seen this a couple of times. For example, and we've seen also that there's been historically friction and pushback, especially from folks from privileged backgrounds, when we've seen, for example, terms like master branch change to main branch once a conversation got going about that. What was done in order to make this at least considerably smoother is folks who had at least some authority in this, like, say, GitHub and the Git project, both went and made the default branch main in later updates to their systems, playing a huge role in rolling this out. And as Taryn said, language evolves.
One excellent resource for self-education of terms and words that are harmful is the Self-Defined app. This is an open source project that folks are encouraged to contribute to. There's also an open collective and GitHub sponsors for this project.
Love self-defined. It also offers alternative terms, which I find really helpful.
Absolutely. Definition: bike shedding. Noun: the futile expenditure of time and energy in discussion of marginal technical issues. Used in a sentence: how many people do you think bike shedded on the creation of that definition?
All right, folks. We've talked about the positives and the negatives of using jargon and specific language in the workplace. We've also got some takeaways based on these that we think can help kick off a conversation about how we can more thoughtfully and inclusively communicate. Number 1.
Opting for clarity. It's tempting for software developers in software development to use abstractions or metaphors to communicate ideas. Instead, let's try to embrace verbosity and be clear on what we're trying to convey. So I just said verbosity. I mean, is that super clear? Verbosity means to give more information than we think might be needed.
I love this. But Taryn, just to clarify, are we saying that folks should write giant walls of text and loads of paragraphs in order to convey ideas?
What we're saying is try to share your ideas in a succinct way, but be aware that prior experience influences our perspective, and not everyone is on the same page, and sometimes not even in the same book. Our second takeaway is to state your intent. So intent is difficult to convey, especially via text. Intention is subjective, and as Kim Creighton has said, impact over intention. The reception of a message or comment varies wildly depending on the situation. The person that sends the message, the interpretation made by the recipient, and the relationship between those people. Don't worry about it, sent by a friend, can be different to the same message sent by a coworker. This is often why companies have team bonding events to help build relationships to make it easier to interpret a person's intent.
I gotta say, the full stop in that sentence is throwing my anxiety for a loop.
Absolutely. Punctuation can be anxiety-inducing for some people. There are techniques for stating your intent with a little more clarity. As an example, in the autistic community, a lot of folks use /s to indicate sarcasm in text, or even fully write the word sarcasm, leaving less room for confusion.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Taryn. Next, let's talk about lending your privilege. Especially when starting out, as I said towards the beginning of this talk, I found myself in a lot of situations where I was scared to ask about terms and I didn't want to interrupt the flow of meetings. And one thing I learned early on, which I've started doing now, is that folks who, even though they might understand and have that clarity, will still ask for clarification just to make 100% sure that everyone is on the same page. And I found this super empowering because it even gives me, as the asker, even though I have most of the clarity, it gives me even more clarity. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I was participating in a little mini conference about content creation, and one of the speakers mentioned SEO, right? And so I asked, even though I knew, I still asked, like, "Hey, what does SEO mean?" And then they told me about what it means, search engine optimization, how it's useful, and it lent more clarity. And some folks even asked me, oh, thank goodness you asked, because I didn't want to interrupt. Of course, you do so with
Thanks so much
respect.
for doing that. It's honestly so helpful to have somebody ask a question like that, even when you know the answer. Previously, I've been on a team and the name of the team was an acronym and I didn't know what it stood for. I was very embarrassed that I was on a team with a name I didn't even know.
Oh gosh, Taryn, I'm sorry to hear that. Did you end up finding out what it stood for?
I ended up asking publicly days later and found out that I wasn't the only one. Lots of people didn't know what the name of our team was.
And I bet, folks, this has happened to lots of you before as well, where you find out that later on that not everybody was on that same page, nor having that clarity. So if you can, do take an extra step to be able to ask those questions. Same goes for acronyms, ask what an acronym stands for, or when you're writing them out, make those explicitly written or verbal. Next, we'll talk about language feedback. As we said a couple times already, having a work culture that encourages feedback, especially on language, helps us thrive. So here's an idea. Why not have dedicated language feedback sessions? For example, there's a book, Docs for Developers, link coming up, where they suggest having audits of documentation. So if possible, why not have language audits?
Have you ever worked anywhere where they've done language audits like this, Ramón?
So not formally, no, but we have had discussions about evolving our internal and external language. You know how we mentioned about having a style guide earlier? This is something that we've gone back on the often and re-examined.
So takeaway 5 is embrace change. We hear a lot of tech folks talking about a growth mindset, building a love of learning, receiving and acting on regular feedback, and becoming less resistant and more adaptive to change. Language is no different, whether in the workplace or your everyday lives. Historically, there have been words, terms, phrases used in our language and products that are harmful. As of October 1st, 2020, all new GitHub repositories were created with the default branch name of main instead of master. As a community, moving forward with removing harmful language is very important.
Thanks, Taryn. Finally, and this one is something that I'm very keen on, is about listening. And I find a lot of the time, kind of an unsung hero of core skills is the ability to listen. And not just to listen, but to listen strategically. When we're working with other people, when we're working with other people, we're going to get feedback. And it is important to separate ourselves from that feedback. Try to listen to that feedback. Try to leave your ego at the door and process it accordingly. When you've caused harm, it's not about you. It's about the person being harmed. Remember, most of the time, this isn't about you, but the language that was used. This is, of course, depending on folks having the space to voice that feedback. Remember, we use words, and we need to be conscious of the evolution of their meaning and context within our lives, ours, and other cultures. Definition. Bus factor. Phrase. A measurement of the risk resulting from information and capabilities not being shared among team members, derived from the phrase, in case they get hit by a bus. Sentence. The glue code between the iOS and Android builds of the app is only maintained by Geraldine, giving it quite a high bus factor.
Now, this is where you come in, dear listeners. It's time to talk about putting your newly found knowledge into practice. So first step, start by keeping a list of jargon you encounter. Observe the language used around you. Be curious. Try to think about when you joined a new workplace, new industry, even a new group of people, and see if you can recall anything that was confusing to you. Traveling or speaking to people with different backgrounds from yourself can actually make you realize some of the interesting things you might say that don't make sense to someone who don't make any sense to someone who doesn't have the same experiences as you.
Absolutely. And to that point, how important it is to pay attention to the language that we use. As said before, A good, healthy work culture should evolve and at the same time invite that feedback. It's a good idea to be conscious not just of yourself and your immediate team, but a future potential team that might either join you, take your place, and of course, the audience that is exposed to that language. So take a moment and look out for your own phrasing of things. Pay attention to idioms, turns of phrase, or jargon that are being used, how you came across these in the first place. You've probably been there before. You looked at language that you used 5, 10 years ago, and you've winced. You've kind of been like, ooh, shouldn't have said that, shouldn't have put it that way. This is what we're talking about.
Keep questioning things. Ask questions and question things. If there's a possibility something said by yourself or the group you're in could be misunderstood, it's always useful to call it out and explain. And when language we use is outdated, question it. Why are we still using something that is harmful or doesn't make sense? Embrace change.
Well said. Okay, folks, you've heard us, but you don't just have to take our word for it. We would also like to offer the perspectives of many others who have worked in either this or adjacent areas. Books. A couple books here for you. Culture Map by Erin Meyer, Badass Making Users Awesome by Kathy Sierra, and Docs for Developers by Badi Corlesen, Born Nunes, and Waterhouse. I did practice that a couple times.
Well done. I'm impressed.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have a talk for you. Really, really great talk by Tatiana Mack called Building Socially Inclusive Design Systems. The link is here at the bottom of this slide. And this is also, they also made the self-defined app. Really, really good resource.
So here's another list of resources we mentioned or referenced during our talk that can help you start your learning journey. You can find the link to our slides here too. Yak shaving. Phrase. A seemingly endless series of small tasks that have to be completed before the next step in a project can move forward. An exceptionally long sentence. So I want to write a blog. In order to write my blog, I need somewhere to put it. So I need to build my personal website. And to build my personal website, I need to... Wait, I'm totally just yak shaving at this point.
And with that said, folks, we don't want to yak shave any further. We want to get on with the conference for today. So I will say TYSM. Thank you so much.
Hold on, Ramón. Hold on. We just gave a talk about this. What is TYSM?
You know what? You're right. My bad. My bad. Thank you so much, friends. You can find Taryn at Taryn Musgrave on Twitter.
And Mastodon. You can find all of Ramón's contacts on his website. We'd love to hear your questions, and we wish you a wonderful You Got This.